In the depths of the unknown, where shadows whisper and fear takes form, welcome to Classic Storytime Hub, the place where classic horror and mystery come alive. Tonight, I bring you a reimagined version of the Call of Cthulhu by H.P. Lovecraft, retold with a suspenseful narrative style that grips the soul and breathes new life into this haunting tale. Make sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss a journey into the shadows.
1. The Horror in Clay. The greatest mercy granted to mankind, I believe, is the mind's inability to weave together the full tapestry of its knowledge. We drift upon a fragile island of ignorance, surrounded on all sides by the black, endless seas of infinity, and it was never meant for us to sail too far. Science, each discipline pulling in its own direction, has so far spared us from the truth. But one day, when scattered fragments of knowledge are pieced together, they will unveil vistas so terrifying, so merciless, that humanity will either collapse into madness or retreat into the false safety of a new self-imposed dark age. Mystics and dreamers have whispered of vast cosmic cycles, where our world and our race are but fleeting sparks in an eternal abyss. They have hinted at survivals so ancient and truths so cold that, if not softened by their hollow optimism, would freeze the very blood. Yet it was not from them that I glimpsed the forbidden. No, it came to me by accident, through the chance alignment of a forgotten newspaper clipping and the scattered notes of a dead professor. That glimpse, brief, dreadful, undeniable, haunts my waking thoughts and poisons my dreams. I pray no one else will ever complete that chain of discovery. As for me, I will never willingly provide another link. I believe the professor himself intended silence and would have destroyed his notes, had death not claimed him first. My own knowledge began in the winter of 1926-27 with the passing of my grand-uncle, George Gammell Angle, Professor Emeritus of Semitic Languages at Brown University. A man of great renown, often consulted by the world's most prestigious museums, his death at 92 was widely noted. Yet in Providence, whispers grew darker, for his end came suddenly, struck down while returning from the Newport boat. Witnesses spoke of a rough-looking sailor who brushed against him on the steep hillside that led from the waterfront to his home on Williams Street. Moments later, the professor collapsed. Physicians, baffled, found no clear cause, only speculating that the strain of the climb had broken his aged heart. At the time, I accepted their verdict, but now I cannot help but wonder, and my wonder has curdled into dread.
As my grand-uncle's heir and executor, he having died a childless widower, it fell to me to sift through the entirety of his papers. I moved the files and boxes to my quarters in Boston, determined to examine them with care. Most of what I uncovered was destined for the American Archaeological Society, yet one box stood apart, locked, and strangely unsettling. The key eluded me until I thought to search the professor's personal ring, which he always carried in his pocket. With it, I opened the box, only to find myself facing a mystery far darker than the lock itself. Inside lay a strange clay bas-relief, surrounded by scattered notes, ramblings, and newspaper clippings. The sight disturbed me deeply. Could it be that in his final years my uncle had fallen prey to the crudest of impostures? I resolved to trace the hand of the eccentric sculptor who had planted such disquiet in the old man's mind. The bas-relief was a rough rectangle, scarcely an inch thick, no larger than the palm of my hand. Though clearly of modern origin, its atmosphere was anything but modern. Its designs carried the cryptic weight of something far older, something that whispered of prehistoric writing. My uncle's vast collections had made me familiar with many ancient scripts, yet this one defied all recognition. Above the strange markings loomed a figure, blurred, impressionistic, yet unmistakably monstrous. My imagination, unwilling though it was, conjured at once the forms of an octopus, a dragon, and a grotesque parody of man. A pulpy, tentacled head crowned a scaly, bloated body, sprouting wings too crude to carry it aloft. But it was not the details that horrified me most. It was the shape as a whole, the dreadful unity of the thing that struck me with a chill I cannot describe. Behind it, faint and indistinct, rose the suggestion of vast cyclopean architecture, an alien backdrop to a nightmare-given form.
Among the professor's papers, one set of writings stood apart. They were in his most recent hand, plain and unadorned, with no attempt at literary flourish. At their head, in careful block letters, as if to prevent any misreading of so alien a word, stood the title Cthulhu Cult. The manuscript was divided into two parts. The first bore the heading 1925, Dream and Dream Work of H.A. Wilcox, 7 Thomas Street, Providence, Rhode Island. The second, Narrative of Inspector John R. LeGrasse, 121 Bionville Street, New Orleans, Louisiana, at 1908 AAS meeting, notes on same, and Professor Webb's account. Scattered among these were shorter notes, fragments of strange dreams reported by various individuals, citations from theosophical texts such as Scott Eliot's Atlantis and The Lost Lemuria, and references to secret societies whispered of in anthropology and folklore. There were clippings, too, from newspapers describing outbreaks of madness, bizarre manias, and inexplicable group delusions that had swept across the world in the spring of 1925. The first half of the manuscript told a tale both peculiar and disturbing. On March 1, 1925, a young man had come to Professor Angle's study, carrying with him the strange clay bas-relief, still damp, still fresh from the sculptor's hand. His card read, Henry Anthony Wilcox. My uncle recognized him at once, the youngest son of a respectable family he had once known. Wilcox had been studying sculpture at the Rhode Island School of Design, living alone in the Fleur-de-Lis building nearby. He was a precocious youth, undeniably gifted, yet marked by eccentricity. From childhood he had been known for his strange tales and the bizarre dreams he recounted with unnerving conviction. He called himself psychically hypersensitive. The people of Providence, however, dismissed him as merely odd. Queer, they said, with the bluntness of the old city. Withdrawn from society, he had faded from view, known only to a small circle of fellow aesthetes from other towns. Even the Providence Art Club, eager to preserve its staid traditions, had long since given up on him.
According to the professor's manuscript, the young sculptor wasted no time. He placed the strange bas-relief before his host and asked, with a dreamy, almost theatrical air, if the professor could identify the hieroglyphics carved upon it. His manner was so affected, so detached, that my uncle grew sharp in his reply, for the clay was far too fresh to belong to any true archaeology.
But Wilcox's answer was unlike anything my uncle expected. In words so fantastically poetic that the professor recorded them verbatim, the youth declared, "It is new indeed, for I made it last night in a dream of strange cities, and dreams are older than brooding Tyre, or the contemplative Sphinx, or garden-girdled Babylon." From there, Wilcox launched into a rambling tale that stirred some long-buried memory in my uncle's mind. The night before, New England had trembled with a rare earthquake. To Wilcox, the tremor had been a spark. That night, he dreamed of vast cyclopean cities, colossal blocks, and sky-piercing monoliths, slick with green slime, heavy with a horror that seemed to breathe from the stones themselves. The walls and pillars were etched with hieroglyphs, and from the depths below rose a presence, a voice that was not a voice. It was no sound, but a sensation, chaotic and oppressive, which his imagination struggled to shape into words. The closest he could come was a jumble of syllables, alien and almost unpronounceable. Cthulhu, Ftang. That phrase struck my uncle like a blow. He questioned the sculptor with relentless precision, studying both the bas-relief and the youth himself with feverish intensity. Wilcox explained that he had awoken in terror, still in his nightclothes, his hands working the clay as though compelled by some unseen force. The professor pressed him with questions, many of them strange, even intrusive, about secret cults, hidden societies, and forbidden lore. Wilcox, baffled, denied any such knowledge. Only when my uncle was convinced of his ignorance did he relent, though not without extracting a promise. Wilcox was to return, day after day, and report his dreams. And so he did. Each visit brought new fragments of nightmare, visions of dripping stone, of titanic ruins, of a subterranean voice hammering at the edges of human comprehension. Always the same two sounds echoed through his accounts, like a dreadful refrain: Cthulhu and Rielye.
On March 23rd, Wilcox failed to appear. Inquiries at his quarters revealed that he had been struck down by a strange fever and carried to his family's home on Waterman Street. That night, he had cried out in terror, waking several artists in the building, and since then had drifted between delirium and unconsciousness. My uncle immediately contacted the family and soon learned that Dr. Toby had taken charge of the case. From that day forward, he followed the youth's condition with obsessive vigilance. The doctor, though reluctant, admitted that Wilcox's fevered mind was haunted by visions so grotesque that he shuddered to repeat them. They were not merely repetitions of his earlier dreams, but wild, incoherent fragments of something far worse, a colossal being, miles high, that walked or lumbered through nightmare landscapes. Though Wilcox never fully described the creature, his frantic mutterings convinced the professor that it was the same monstrosity he had sculpted in clay. Each mention of it was followed by a collapse into lethargy, as though the mere thought drained the last of his strength. Curiously, his temperature was never much above normal, yet his condition bore all the marks of a true fever rather than madness. Then, on April 2nd, at precisely 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the illness vanished as suddenly as it had come. Wilcox sat upright in bed, bewildered, with no memory of anything, dream or reality, since the night of March 22nd. Declared well, he returned to his quarters within days, but to Professor Angel, he was of no further use. The strange dreams had ended with his recovery, leaving behind only trivial, ordinary visions unworthy of record. Here, the first part of the manuscript closed. Yet scattered notes hinted at something far more disturbing. My uncle, it seemed, had cast a wide net of inquiry, asking friends and acquaintances alike to report their dreams during the same period as Wilcox's delirium. The responses were many, more than one man could have managed without a secretary, and though most were negative, the pattern was undeniable. Ordinary men and women, the salt of the earth, reported little more than vague unease, yet between March 23rd and April 2nd, scattered cases emerged, restless nights, formless impressions, and a sense of dread without cause. Even among scientists, usually immune to such fancies, there were 4 reports of strange landscapes glimpsed in sleep, and in one case, a chilling sense of something abnormal pressing in from beyond.
It was from the artists and poets that the most disturbing answers came. Had they compared notes, I am certain panic would have swept through their circles. As it was, their letters, fragmentary, scattered, and never shared, remained isolated, and I half suspected my uncle of shaping them to fit his own conclusions. Perhaps, I thought, Wilcox had somehow learned of the professor's earlier researches and was weaving a cruel deception. Yet the testimonies of these aesthetes told a chilling tale. From February 28th to April 2nd, many of them dreamed strange, grotesque visions. The intensity of these dreams reached its peak during the very days of Wilcox's delirium. More than a quarter of the dreamers described scenes and sounds eerily similar to his own. Vast, dripping stone cities and the looming presence of a nameless, monstrous thing. Some confessed to a terror so acute that they awoke screaming. One case stood out with tragic clarity. A well-known architect, fascinated by theosophy and the occult, went violently insane on the very day of Wilcox's seizure. He lingered for months, shrieking endlessly to be saved from some escaped denizen of hell, until death finally silenced him. Had my uncle recorded names instead of numbers, I would have sought corroboration myself. As it was, I traced only a few cases, and each confirmed his notes in full. I often wonder if those questioned ever realized how their private nightmares fit into a far greater pattern. It is merciful, perhaps, that they never did. The press clippings were worse still. Professor Angle must have employed a bureau, for the extracts were countless and drawn from every corner of the globe. A suicide in London, where a sleeper leapt from his window after a single terrible cry. A letter in South America, raving of visions and a dire future. In California, a theosophist colony donned white robes, awaiting a glorious fulfillment that never came. Reports from India spoke cautiously of unrest. In Haiti, voodoo orgies multiplied. In Africa, colonial outposts whispered of ominous mutterings. American officers in the Philippines noted strange agitation among native tribes. In New York, police were mobbed by hysterical Levantines on the night of March 22nd, 23rd. In Ireland, wild rumors spread like fire. And in Paris, a painter named Ardoz Bonnot unveiled a blasphemous canvas, dream landscape, that seemed torn from the same nightmare. Even the asylums were not spared. Madness surged in their wards, so widespread that it is a wonder the medical fraternity did not connect the parallels and draw some dreadful conclusion. A strange, terrible collection of evidence all told, and yet at the time I set it aside, with cold rationalism, convinced that Wilcox had merely been playing upon my uncle's knowledge of older, darker matters.
2. The Tale of Inspector Legras. The second half of my uncle's manuscript dealt with older matters, events that gave Wilcox's dreams and his strange bas-relief a dreadful significance. For once before, Professor Angel had glimpsed the same monstrous outlines, puzzled over the same alien hieroglyphs, and heard the same unholy syllables, Cthulhu. Small wonder, then, that he pursued the young sculptor with such relentless questions. That earlier encounter had taken place in 1908, 17 years before, during the annual meeting of the American Archaeological Society in St. Louis.
Professor Angel, as one of the foremost authorities in his field, was deeply involved in the proceedings. It was there that he was approached by an outsider, a man whose presence would soon command the attention of the entire gathering. He was unremarkable in appearance, a middle-aged man of ordinary bearing. Yet he had traveled all the way from New Orleans with a mystery no local scholar could solve. His name was John Raymond Legrasse, Inspector of Police. In his possession he carried the object of his inquiry, a grotesque, repulsive statuette of stone so ancient in appearance and so hideous in design that it defied all classification. Legrasse was no antiquarian. His interest in the idol was not scholarly, but professional. Months earlier, his men had raided a gathering deep in the swamps south of New Orleans, a gathering they had believed to be a voodoo ceremony. What they found was something far darker. The rites were unspeakable, the chants inhuman, and at the center of it all stood the idol. The police quickly realized they had stumbled upon a cult unlike any they had ever encountered, something older, more secretive, and infinitely more diabolic than the blackest voodoo circles. Yet of its origin they could learn nothing. The captured worshippers babbled incoherently, their tales wild and unbelievable. And so Inspector Legrasse had come to St. Louis, desperate for any scrap of antiquarian knowledge that might identify the symbol and lead him to the source of the cult's power. Inspector Legrasse had not expected the sensation his offering would cause. The moment the scholars laid eyes on it, a hush fell over the room. Men of science, seasoned, rational, skeptical, pressed forward with an eagerness bordering on dread. For in that small figure, scarcely 8 inches tall, there was something so utterly alien, so ancient, that it seemed to whisper of worlds and ages long forgotten. The statuette was passed from hand to trembling hand. Its surface, a dim greenish-black stone flecked with strange iridescence, bore the weight of centuries, perhaps millennia, yet belonged to no known geology. No school of art, no civilization, no culture could claim it. It was as if it had been shaped in some other cycle of existence, apart from mankind entirely. The figure itself was monstrous, vaguely anthropoid in outline, yet grotesquely distorted. Its head was that of a cephalopod, a mass of writhing feelers spilling down over a bloated, scaly body. Long, narrow wings jutted from its back, while its limbs ended in claws of obscene proportion. It squatted upon a block carved with indecipherable symbols, its posture hunched, its claws gripping the pedestal as though ready to spring. The tentacled face bent forward, the feelers brushing against the forepaws that clasped its raised knees. What made it most dreadful was not its form, but its vitality. The thing seemed alive, instinct with a malignancy that no mere stone should hold. Its very presence radiated a sense of ancient, unholy power. The scholars, for all their learning, could not place it. The characters on the base were as baffling as the figure itself, belonging to no known language, no known lineage of human thought. It was as if the idol had slipped into our world from some other order of existence, something frightfully remote, something that had no part in the history of mankind.
The scholars had all but given up, shaking their heads in defeat before the inspector's mystery. Yet one man hesitated. With a trace of unease, he admitted that the figure and its strange markings stirred in him a faint, unsettling familiarity. This was Professor William Channing Webb of Princeton, an anthropologist and seasoned explorer. Nearly half a century earlier, he had journeyed through Greenland and Iceland in search of ancient runic inscriptions. He had found none. But in the frozen wastes of West Greenland, he had stumbled upon something far more disturbing. There, hidden among the cliffs and ice, he encountered a degenerate tribe of Eskimos whose religion was unlike anything he had ever seen. It was not worship, but devil worship, deliberate, bloodthirsty, and revolting. Other tribes spoke of them only in whispers, claiming their rites had descended from aeons before the world itself was made. Their ceremonies were unspeakable. Nameless rituals, human sacrifices, and chants to a supreme elder devil they called Tornasuk. From one wizened priest, Professor Webb had carefully transcribed a phonetic record of their ritual words, capturing the sounds in Roman letters as best he could. But most striking of all was the fetish they revered. When the aurora blazed across the sky, they danced around it in frenzy. It was a crude stone bas-relief, hideous in form, etched with cryptic symbols. And though rough, it bore a disturbing resemblance to the very idol now lying before the assembled scholars. The room grew tense with astonishment. Inspector Legrasse leaned forward eagerly, for he too had recorded the chants of the swamp cultists his men had captured. He pressed Webb to recall the syllables of the Eskimo ritual. What followed was a painstaking comparison, detail against detail, sound against sound, and then silence. A silence heavy with awe and dread, for both detective and professor agreed the two chants, born of worlds apart, were virtually identical. And what both the Arctic wizards and the Louisiana swamp priests had cried out to their idols was this: Funglui Mugluanoff, Cthulhu, Relay, Waganal, Ftagan.
Legrasse held one advantage over Professor Webb. His prisoners, mongrel worshippers dragged from the swamps, had whispered to him the meaning of their chant. The words, they said, meant this: "In his house at Riley, dead Cthulhu waits dreaming." The phrase hung in the air like a curse. And now, urged on by the assembled scholars, Inspector Legrasse began to recount his experience with the swamp cult, a tale so grotesque that my uncle listened with fevered intensity. It was November 1st, 1907, when the New Orleans police received a frantic summons from the swamp country to the south. The squatters there, descendants of Lafitte's men, rough but harmless folk, were paralyzed with terror. Something had come upon them in the night. At first, they thought it was voodoo, but this was no voodoo they had ever known. Women and children had vanished. From deep within the black woods came the endless pounding of tom-toms, the shrieks of the mad, the chants of devils, and the flicker of flames that danced against the trees. The squatters could endure no more, and so 20 policemen set out, 2 carriages and an automobile, guided by a trembling messenger. They rode until the road gave out, then pressed on foot, splashing through the cypress swamps in grim silence. The woods were a nightmare. The air was heavy, the ground treacherous. Roots twisted like serpents beneath their boots, and Spanish moss hung in choking nooses from the branches. Here and there, the ruins of ancient walls or piles of damp stone hinted at habitation long since rotted away, each fragment deepening the sense of dread. At last, the squatter settlement appeared, a pitiful cluster of huts, its people hysterical, clinging to the glow of the policemen's lanterns. From far ahead, faint but steady, came the muffled beat of the tom-toms. Now and then the wind carried a shriek that froze the blood, and through the pale undergrowth a reddish glare flickered as though some infernal fire burned beyond the trees. But the squatters would go no further. Terrified, they refused to advance another step. And so, with only their lanterns to pierce the blackness, Inspector Legrasse and his 19 men pressed on alone, into the haunted woods, into the arcades of shadow where no man of New Orleans had ever dared to tread.
The land into which Legrasse and his men now pressed was a place of whispered legend, an accursed region, avoided even by the hardiest squatters. Tales spoke of a hidden lake, unseen by mortal eyes, where a vast, formless thing with luminous orbs stirred beneath the surface. Others swore that bat-winged devils rose from caverns deep within the earth to worship it beneath the midnight sky. They said it had been there before the explorers, before the Indians, before even the beasts of the forest. It was nightmare itself, and to behold it was to die. Yet it haunted men's dreams, and so they kept away. The voodoo orgy was held on the very fringe of this dreaded zone, and perhaps it was the place itself, more than the sounds, that had driven the squatters into terror. As the police advanced, the noises grew unbearable. No human tongue could fully capture them. There are sounds that belong to men, and sounds that belong to beasts, and it is a horror beyond words when the two are exchanged. Animal fury and human frenzy blended into a storm of howls, shrieks, and guttural ecstasies that shook the swamp like a tempest from hell. At intervals, the chaos fell into order, and a chorus of hoarse voices rose in unison, chanting that dreadful refrain, "Finglu maglunaf Cthulhu Reimagined tag." The words rolled through the trees like a curse. Then, as the forest thinned, the men saw it. 4 staggered back, 1 collapsed in a faint, and 2 cried out in terror, though their voices were swallowed by the orgiastic din. Legrasse splashed swamp water on the fainting man, and together they stood, trembling, transfixed by the sight before them. In a natural glade, on a grassy island clear of trees, the nightmare unfolded. Around a colossal bonfire, a horde of naked, twisted figures leapt and writhed in obscene abandon. They were neither wholly human nor wholly beast, but some hideous hybrid spawn, braying and bellowing in a frenzy of worship. At the center of the fire ring loomed a colossal monolith, 8 feet tall, its surface blackened by flame. And upon its summit, incongruous in size, yet dreadful in presence, rested the idol, the same noxious statuette of Cthulhu. But worse were the scaffolds. 10 of them, arranged in a wide circle around the monolith, each bearing a body hung head downward, squatters who had vanished from their homes, now offered as sacrifices. Between the ring of fire and the ring of corpses, the worshippers danced in endless frenzied procession, their motion circling left to right in a blasphemous bacchanal. The swamp itself seemed to pulse with their madness.
One of the policemen, an excitable Spaniard named Joseph D. Galvez, later swore he heard something more than the cult's chanting, an echo, an antiphonal response rising from deeper within the cursed woods. He even hinted of faint wing beats, of gleaming eyes, of a mountainous white shape glimpsed between the trees. Perhaps it was only imagination, or the weight of native superstition pressing on his mind. But the thought lingered. The pause of horror among Legrasse's men was brief. Duty demanded action. Though nearly 100 cultists writhed in the fire-lit circle, the police raised their weapons and charged. What followed was chaos. 5 minutes of indescribable din. Shots cracked, blows fell, bodies scattered. When the smoke cleared, 47 prisoners stood sullen and subdued, forced into line between 2 rows of armed officers. 5 lay dead, and 2 more, badly wounded, were carried away by their fellows. The idol atop the monolith was seized, wrapped, and taken into custody. Back at headquarters, after a night of exhaustion and strain, the prisoners were examined. They were a motley, degraded lot: sailors, drifters, West Indians, Cape Verdeans, men of mixed blood and broken minds. At first, their answers seemed to hint at voodoo, but soon it became clear that this was something far older, far darker. For despite their ignorance, they spoke with chilling consistency of their faith. They worshipped, they said, the great old ones, beings who ruled the earth before mankind, who came down from the stars in ages uncounted. Now they were gone, entombed beneath the sea and buried deep within the earth. But their dead bodies still whispered in dreams, teaching the first men the secrets of their worship. That worship had never ceased. It had spread in secret, hidden in deserts, jungles, and wastelands. Waiting. Always waiting. For the day would come when the great priest Cthulhu, from his sunken city of R'lyeh, would rise again. When the stars were right, he would call, and the cult, spread across the world, eternal and patient, would be ready to set him free.
No more could be forced from the cultists. There was a secret, they said, which even torture could not extract. Humanity was not alone among the conscious things of earth. Shapes came out of the dark to visit the faithful. But these were not the great old ones. No man had ever seen them. The idol was Cthulhu, yes, but none could say if the others were like him. The ancient writing was unreadable. The true secrets passed only by whispered word of mouth. The chant itself was no secret. It meant only this: in his house at R'lyeh, dead Cthulhu waits dreaming. Of the prisoners, only 2 were deemed sane enough to hang. The rest were consigned to asylums, gibbering and broken. All denied the ritual murders, insisting instead that the killings had been done by black-winged ones, beings who came from the haunted woods to join their rites. But of these allies, no coherent account could ever be gained. The most damning revelations came from an ancient mestizo named Castro, who claimed to have sailed to strange ports and spoken with undying leaders of the cult in the mountains of China. His words were fragments of legend so hideous they made the speculations of theosophists seem like children's tales. There had been eons, he said, when other things ruled the earth. They had built vast cities, cyclopean and alien, whose ruins still lay scattered on forgotten Pacific isles. They had died long before man appeared, yet their arts could revive them when the stars wheeled once more into the proper alignment. For they had come from the stars, and with them had brought their images. These great old ones were not of flesh and blood as we know it. They had form, yes, the idol proved that, but it was not matter as mortals understand it. When the stars were right, they could leap between worlds. When the stars were wrong, they could not live. Yet though they no longer lived, they could never truly die. Now they lay in stone houses in the drowned city of R'lyeh, preserved by the spells of mighty Cthulhu, waiting for the day of resurrection. But they could not rise unaided. Some force from outside must break the seals. Until then, they could only lie awake in the dark, thinking, while millions of years rolled by. They knew all that transpired in the universe. Their speech was thought itself. Even now, Castro whispered, they spoke from their tombs. And when the first men came, the great old ones reached into their dreams, molding their visions, for only thus could their alien language touch the fragile minds of flesh.
Then, whispered old Castro, the first men had formed the cult around the idols the great ones had shown them, idols carried across the gulfs of time from dark stars. That cult would never die. It would wait, hidden, until the stars came right again. Then the secret priests would unseal the tomb of great Cthulhu, revive his subjects, and restore his dominion over the earth. The sign of that time would be unmistakable. Humanity itself would have changed, become like the great old ones, free, wild, beyond good and evil. Laws and morals would crumble, and mankind would revel in chaos, killing and shouting in ecstasy.
And when the old ones rose, they would teach new ways to kill, new ways to revel, until the earth itself burned in a holocaust of freedom and madness. Meanwhile, the cult must keep the memory alive. Through their rites, they preserved the prophecy, shadowing forth the day of return. In elder times, chosen men had spoken with the entombed old ones in dreams. But then came the great catastrophe. The stone city of Riley, with its monoliths and sepulchres, sank beneath the waves. The deep waters, filled with the primal mystery through which even thought cannot pass, severed the spectral communion. Yet memory endured. The high priests swore the city would rise again when the stars were right. From the earth, too, came whispers, black spirits, moldy and shadowy, carrying rumors from caverns beneath forgotten sea bottoms. But of these, Castro would say no more. He cut himself off, refusing to speak of their nature or the true size of the old ones. As for the cult itself, he believed its heart lay in the pathless deserts of Arabia, where Iram, the city of pillars, still dreams untouched. It was not allied to the witch cults of Europe and remained virtually unknown beyond its initiates. No book had ever truly revealed it, though the deathless sages of China claimed that hidden meanings lay within the Necronomicon of the mad Arab Abdul al-Hazred. And there, whispered Castro, was the couplet that all initiates knew. That is not dead which can eternal lie, and with strange eons even death may die.
Legras, deeply impressed and more than a little bewildered, had searched in vain for any trace of the cult's history. Castro, it seemed, had spoken the truth when he claimed it was wholly secret. The scholars at Tulane University could shed no light on either the idol or its worshippers, and now, before the highest authorities in the land, Legras had gained nothing more than Professor Webb's strange tale from Greenland. The sensation caused by his account, corroborated as it was by the hideous statuette, echoed long afterward in private correspondence among those present. Yet in the official records of the society there was scarcely a mention. Scholars are cautious, wary of charlatans and impostors. For a time, Legras lent the idol to Professor Webb, but upon Webb's death it was returned to him. There it remained, and I myself have looked upon it. It is a terrible thing, unmistakably akin to the dream sculpture of young Wilcox. That my uncle was electrified by the sculptor's tale is no mystery. What thoughts must have surged through his mind, knowing what Legras had uncovered, and then hearing of a sensitive young man who had dreamed not only the very figure and hieroglyphics of the swamp idol and the Greenland tablet, but who had also uttered in sleep at least 3 of the precise words chanted by both Eskimo sorcerers and Louisiana cultists. It was only natural that Professor Angell launched at once into a thorough investigation. Yet I, reading his notes, could not help but suspect Wilcox of trickery. Surely he had heard of the cult in some indirect way, and had spun a series of dreams to prey upon the curiosity of an aged scholar. The dream narratives and clippings my uncle collected were strong corroboration, yes, but the extravagance of the whole affair and the rationalism of my own mind led me to what I thought the most sensible conclusion. And so, after studying the manuscript once more and weighing the theosophical and anthropological notes against Legras's dreadful narrative, I resolved to act. I traveled to Providence, determined to confront the sculptor himself and deliver the rebuke I thought fitting for one who had so boldly imposed upon a learned and venerable man. Wilcox still lived alone in the Fleur-de-Lis building on Thomas Street, a grotesque Victorian imitation of Breton architecture, its gaudy stucco front jarring against the quiet dignity of the colonial houses around it, and looming beneath the shadow of America's finest Georgian steeple. I found him in his rooms, at work. At once I conceded his genius. The scattered specimens of his art revealed a mind both profound and authentic. One day, I thought, his name would be heard among the great decadents, for he had given form in clay and would one day carve in marble the very nightmares and fantasies that Arthur Machen conjured in prose, and Clark Ashton Smith evoked in verse and paint. He was dark, frail, and somewhat unkempt. At my knock, he turned languidly, asking my business without rising. When I told him who I was, his interest quickened. My uncle's probing of his dreams had intrigued him, though the professor had never revealed why. I did not enlighten him, but sought instead to draw him out. It took little time to be convinced of his sincerity. He spoke of his dreams with a conviction no impostor could feign. They had seeped into his art, shaping it unconsciously. He showed me a statue, morbid, grotesque, whose contours made me shudder with their black suggestion. He swore he had never seen its like, save in the dream bas-relief he had once sculpted. The outlines, he said, had formed themselves beneath his hands, as though compelled by some unseen force. Surely it was the giant shape he had raved of in delirium. That he knew nothing of the hidden cult, save what my uncle's relentless questioning had let slip, soon became clear. Yet I strained to imagine how such impressions could have reached him at all. He spoke of his dreams in a strangely poetic fashion, painting them with words that chilled me. I saw through his telling the damp cyclopean city of slimy green stone, its geometry all wrong, its angles defying reason. I heard, with dreadful expectancy, the ceaseless half-mental calling from beneath the earth. Cthulhu Ftan, Cthulhu Ftan. These words, part of the ritual that told of Cthulhu's dream vigil in his stone vault at Riley, stirred me deeply despite my rational disbelief. I told myself Wilcox must have heard of the cult in some casual way, forgotten it, and later given it subconscious form in his dreams, his bas-relief, and the terrible statue I now beheld. If he had imposed upon my uncle, it was an innocent imposture. The youth himself was of a type I could never like, slightly affected, slightly ill-mannered. Yet I could not deny his genius, nor his honesty. I left him amicably, wishing him the success his strange talent surely promised.
The cult still haunted my thoughts. At times, I even dreamed of personal fame, imagining myself the one to uncover its origins and connections, to drag into the light a religion so ancient and secret that its discovery would make me a scholar of renown. I traveled to New Orleans, spoke with Legros and the men of that old raiding party, saw again the frightful idol, and even questioned the surviving prisoners. Old Castro was long dead, but what I heard firsthand was no different from what my uncle had recorded, only more vivid, more damning. And still, I clung to my materialism, dismissing the coincidences of Wilcox's dreams and my uncle's clippings as if reason alone could shield me. Yet one suspicion grew, and now I fear it is truth. My uncle's death was not natural. He fell on a narrow hill street, jostled by a sailor of dubious origin. But I remember the mixed blood and seafaring ways of the cultists in Louisiana, and I could not dismiss the thought of secret poisons, ancient methods, and ruthless hands. Legros and his men had been spared, yes, but in Norway, a seaman who had glimpsed too much was dead. Could it be that my uncle's deeper inquiries, after Wilcox, after the dreams,
had reached ears that must never hear? I believe now that Professor Engel died because he knew too much, or because he was about to. And whether I too shall meet his fate remains to be seen, for I have learned much, far too much.
3. The madness from the sea. If heaven ever grants me a mercy, it will be the erasure of that chance moment when my eyes fell upon a stray scrap of shelf paper. It was nothing I should ever have noticed in the course of ordinary life, an old issue of the Sydney Bulletin dated April 18, 1925. Somehow, it had escaped even the cutting bureau that had once scoured the world for my uncle's research. By then, I had nearly abandoned my inquiries into what Professor Engel had called the Cthulhu cult. I was visiting a learned friend in Paterson, New Jersey, the curator of a local museum, a mineralogist of some renown. One afternoon, while examining reserve specimens in a dim storage room, my eye caught an image printed on the newspaper spread beneath the stones. It was a half-tone illustration of a hideous stone idol, a figure almost identical to the one Legrasse had seized from the swamp. My heart quickened. Clearing the sheet of its burden, I read the article with feverish haste. It was brief, disappointingly so, yet its implications were vast. I tore it out at once, for it was a clue of dreadful significance. The headline read, "Mystery derelict found at sea. Vigilant arrives with helpless armed New Zealand yacht in tow. One survivor and dead man found aboard. Tale of desperate battle and deaths at sea. Rescued seaman refuses particulars of strange experience. Odd idol found in his possession. Inquiry to follow." The report told of the freighter Vigilant arriving in Darling Harbor with the battered steam yacht Alert of Dunedin, New Zealand, in tow. The yacht had been sighted on April 12th, adrift at latitude 34 degrees 21 south, longitude 152 degrees 17 west. Aboard were 2 men, one dead for over a week, the other half delirious, clutching a stone idol about a foot in height. The Vigilant had left Valparaiso on March 25th and been driven far south by monstrous storms and waves. When they boarded the derelict, they found the survivor raving, the idol clutched in his arms. Authorities at Sydney University, the Royal Society, and the College Street Museum all professed bafflement at the figure's nature. The survivor claimed he had found it in the yacht's cabin in a small carved shrine.
The survivor was Gustav Johansen, a Norwegian of sober intelligence, second mate of the schooner Emma of Auckland. His tale, once his senses returned, was one of piracy, slaughter, and something far worse. The Emma had sailed for Callao on February 20th with 11 men. A great storm on March 1st drove her far south of her course, and on March 22nd, at latitude 49 degrees 51 minutes south and longitude 128 degrees 34 minutes west, she encountered the steam yacht Alert. Its crew, Kanakas and half-castes of sinister aspect, hailed them with a peremptory order to turn back. Captain Collins refused. Without warning, the Alert opened fire with heavy brass cannon. The Emma staggered under the blows, water rushing in beneath her waterline. Yet her crew fought back, grappling alongside the yacht and boarding her in desperation. The fight was savage, the enemy's style abhorrent and frenzied, but clumsy. One by one the cultists fell. When the deck was cleared, 3 of the Emma's men lay dead, including Captain Collins and First Mate Green. The remaining 8, under Johansen, seized the yacht and pressed onward, determined to discover what lay ahead that the cultists had sought to bar. The next day, they sighted land, an island, though no chart marked such a place in that part of the ocean. They landed, and there something happened. 6 men died ashore. Johansen would say little,
only that they fell into a rock chasm. His silence was more terrible than any detail. Later, Johansen and one companion, William Bryden, managed to bring the yacht off the island. But on April 2nd, the storm struck again, battering them mercilessly. From then until his rescue on April 12th, Johansen remembered little. He could not even recall when Bryden died. The man's death bore no wound, no mark, perhaps only the toll of terror and exposure. Reports from Dunedin confirmed the Alert's reputation. The yacht was known as an island trader, whispered of with suspicion along the waterfront. Its owners, a curious group of half-castes, were notorious for their secret meetings and nocturnal excursions into the woods, and it had sailed in great haste immediately after the storm and earth tremors of March 1st. The Emma and her crew, by contrast, were of excellent repute, and Johansen himself was described as a sober, worthy man. The Admiralty announced an inquiry, determined to press him for the details he had withheld.
That article, with its picture of the hellish idol, set my mind ablaze. Here was fresh evidence, proof that the cult's reach extended not only across continents, but across the seas. What motive had driven the hybrid crew of the Alert to order back the Emma? What was the nameless island where 6 men had perished, and why was Johansen so secretive about it? What had the Vice Admiralty uncovered in its inquiry, and what of the cult's shadow in Dunedin? Most disturbing of all was the linkage of dates, a pattern too precise to ignore. March 1st, or February 28th by the international dateline, the earthquake and storm struck. From Dunedin, the Alert and her noisome crew sailed forth as if summoned. Across the world, poets and artists began to dream of a dank, cyclopean city, while a young sculptor molded in his sleep the very form of Cthulhu. March 23rd, the crew of the Emma landed on an unknown island, leaving 6 men dead. That same day, the dreams of sensitive souls grew darker, filled with the pursuit of a monstrous presence. An architect went mad. A sculptor fell into delirium. April 2nd, the storm came again. On that day, all dreams of the drowned city ceased. Wilcox awoke, free of his fever. The siege of mankind's soul had ended, at least for now. Could this be mere coincidence? Or was I staring into the very machinery of cosmic horror, the rhythm of forces beyond human comprehension? If so, they were horrors of the mind alone. For something in that April storm had silenced the menace, had driven it back into the abyss. That evening, after frantic cables and arrangements, I left my host and boarded a train for San Francisco. Within a month, I was in Dunedin. Yet there I found little. The cultists had been nothing more than waterfront scum, too common to draw lasting notice. There were vague whispers of an inland journey, of faint drumming and red flames on distant hills, but nothing more. In Auckland, I learned that Johansen had returned from Sydney with his hair turned white. After a perfunctory and inconclusive inquiry, he had sold his cottage and sailed with his wife back to Oslo. Of his ordeal, he would speak no more than he had told the Admiralty. His friends could only give me his address. And so the trail led inexorably to Norway. In Sydney, my search yielded little. I spoke with seamen, with members of the Vice Admiralty Court, but gained nothing. I saw the Alert itself, now stripped of mystery and pressed into commercial use at Circular Quay. Its bulk was mute, its secrets sealed. The idol, however, remained. Preserved in the museum at Hyde Park, it crouched in its case, cuttlefish head, dragon body, scaly wings and pedestal carved with indecipherable signs. I studied it long and well. Its workmanship was exquisite, yet baleful. Its antiquity was terrible. Its material utterly alien. Geologists confessed bafflement, swearing no stone like it existed on Earth. And then I remembered Castro's words. They had come from the stars,
and had brought their images with them. Shaken by a mental revolution unlike any I had known, I resolved to seek out Johansen himself. From London I sailed again, and one autumn day I landed at the trim wharves of Oslo, beneath the shadow of the Ishaberg. His address lay in the old town of King Harald Hardrada, where the ancient name of Oslo had endured through centuries of masquerade as Christiana. My heart pounded as I knocked at the plastered front of a neat old building. The door opened to a woman in black, her face lined with sorrow. In halting English, she told me the truth. Gustav Johansen was dead. The sea had broken him, she said. He had spoken no more to her than he had to the public, but he had left behind a manuscript, written in English to shield her from its contents. He had called it Technical Matters. His death had been sudden, almost absurd. Walking near the Gothenburg dock, a bundle of papers had fallen from an attic window, striking him down. 2 Lascar sailors helped him to his feet, but before the ambulance arrived, he was gone. The physicians found no cause, only a weakened heart, they said. But I knew better. Johansen had carried a secret too great for mortal men, and now only his manuscript remained. I read Johansen's manuscript with a dread that gnawed at my very soul. It was no polished account, but the rambling diary of a sailor, simple, naive, yet all the more terrible for its honesty. And though Johansen never grasped the full truth, what he saw was enough to rob me of sleep forever. The voyage began as he had told the Vice-Admiralty. The Emma, in ballast, cleared Auckland on February 20th. Then came the storm of March 1st, earthquake-born, a tempest that seemed to heave something monstrous from the sea's abyss. Once recovered, the schooner pressed on, only to be halted on March 22nd by the Alert. Johansen wrote of the cultists with loathing. There was something peculiarly abominable about them, something that made their destruction seem less like battle than a grim necessity. He even expressed wonder that the court had accused his men of ruthlessness. But it was what came after that sealed their fate. Sailing the captured yacht, curiosity drove them onward, and then, at latitude 47 degrees 9 minutes south, longitude 126 degrees 43 minutes west, they saw it. First, a lone stone pillar jutting from the waves. Then, a coastline, mud, slime, and weed-choked masonry of impossible scale. A city, a corpse city. Relay. The nightmare city of legend, built in eons before history by loathsome shapes that seeped down from the stars. Its blocks were cyclopean, its angles wrong, its geometry a blasphemy against reason. There, in slimy green vaults beneath the sea, lay great Cthulhu and his horde, dreaming, whispering, sending out thoughts that had poisoned the dreams of men, summoning the faithful to their pilgrimage of liberation. Johansen did not know this, but God help him, he soon saw enough.
Johansen believed that only a single mountaintop had risen, the monolith-crowned citadel where great Cthulhu lay entombed. Yet even that fragment was enough to unhinge the soul. When I think of what may still brood beneath those waters, I nearly wish for death myself. The sailors were struck dumb by the sight. This was no city of men, nor of any sane planet. It was a dripping Babylon of elder daemons, its greenish blocks vast beyond comprehension, its monoliths towering dizzyingly into the sky. The statues and bas-reliefs were unmistakable, grotesque twins of the idol found aboard the Alert. Johansen's words, though simple, carried the weight of nightmare. He did not describe buildings but impressions, vast angles, endless surfaces, carved with impious hieroglyphs. The geometry itself was wrong, non-Euclidean, loathsome, suggestive of dimensions beyond our own. What Wilcox had dreamed, Johansen had seen. They landed on a sloping mud bank and clambered up the ooze-slick blocks too titanic to have ever been meant for mortal feet. The very sunlight seemed warped, filtered through a miasma that rose from the sea-soaked stones. Angles shifted as they looked. What was convex became concave. What was flat seemed to bulge outward. The city itself mocked perception, twisting reality into menace. Fear gripped them before they saw anything more than rock and slime. Each man longed to flee, yet pride held them fast. Half-heartedly, they searched for some token to carry away, but the city yielded nothing, save dread.
It was Rodriguez, the Portuguese, who first climbed the foot of the monolith and shouted down what he had found. The others followed, and there before them loomed an immense carved door, its surface writhing with the now familiar squid dragon bas-relief. Johansen wrote that it was like a barn door, yet no mortal barn could ever boast such scale. The lintel, the threshold, the jambs, all suggested a portal, but whether it lay flat like a trap door or slanted like a cellar entrance, none could say. The geometry was wrong. The very ground and sea seemed to shift so that no man could be certain of what was level or what was real. Britton pressed against the stone, but it did not yield. Then Donovan traced its edges with careful fingers, pressing point by point. He climbed, or slid, or crawled, for in that place one could not tell what was up or down, along the grotesque moldings. And then, impossibly, the vast panel began to move. Softly, slowly, the acre-wide slab receded inward, balanced on some alien pivot. It moved diagonally, monstrously, upsetting every law of matter and perspective. Donovan rejoined his fellows, and together they watched as the portal opened. What lay beyond was not mere shadow, but a darkness with weight, a tenebrousness that poured outward like smoke, blotting the sun, staining the sky. It seemed alive, flapping away on membranous wings. The stench that rose from the depths was unbearable. Then Hawkins, quick of ear, stiffened. He heard it first, a wet, slopping sound from below. The others listened, and they were still listening when it came. It lumbered into sight, slobbering, groping, forcing its way through the black aperture. A gelatinous green immensity, obscene in its bulk, squeezed into the poisoned air of that nightmare city. Cthulhu had awakened.
Johansen's handwriting faltered here, as though the memory itself broke his strength. Of the 6 men who never reached the ship, he believed 2 died of sheer fright in that instant. For how could mortal minds endure the sight of such a thing? It cannot be described. There is no language for such abysses of lunacy, such contradictions of matter and law. A mountain walked or stumbled. A living mass of slime and nightmare, the spawn of alien stars, had awakened to claim its own. The stars were right again, and what the cult had failed to achieve by design, a handful of sailors had accomplished by accident. After uncounted ages, Cthulhu was loose. 3 men were seized at once, swept up in the flabby claws, Donovan, Guerrera, Engstrom, gone in a heartbeat. Parker slipped as the others fled, and Johansen swore he was swallowed by an angle of masonry that should not have existed, an acute angle behaving as if it were obtuse. Only Johansen and Bryden reached the boat. They rowed desperately for the Alert, while behind them the Titan floundered down the slimy stones, hesitating at the water's edge. By some miracle, steam had not fully died in the yacht's engines.
Feverishly, Johansen rushed between wheel and boiler, coaxing life back into the vessel. Slowly, agonizingly, the alert began to churn the black waters. On the shore, the thing gibbered and slavered, like Polyphemus cursing Odysseus. But unlike the Cyclops of legend, this god dared the sea. With obscene grace, Cthulhu slid into the water, his strokes raising waves of cosmic force. Bryden looked back. That was his undoing. He laughed. Shrill, mad laughter that echoed through the cabin until death silenced him days later. And Johansen, delirious, pressed on, alone, against the god.
Johansen's desperate gambit had bought him life, but not peace. He had rammed the god itself, split its form like a bursting bladder, and watched it scatter into a seething, acrid cloud. Yet even as the alert gained speed, he saw the horror recombine, its plastic flesh knitting itself together, its hateful shape rising once more in the distance. That was all. Afterward, Johansen brooded in silence, staring at the idol in the cabin, tending only to food for himself and the laughing madman beside him. The fight had drained his soul. He made no effort to navigate. Then came the storm of April 2nd, and with it a delirium of visions, whirling gulfs of infinity, plunges through reeling universes, laughter of elder gods echoing across the void. Out of that nightmare came rescue, the vigilant, the court, the voyage home. He could not tell the truth. They would call him mad. So he wrote it down, in secret, for death to seal. And now I too have read it. I have placed his manuscript in the tin box, beside the bas-relief and my uncle's papers. With it goes this record of mine, this test of my sanity. I have pieced together what should never be pieced together. I have looked upon all that the universe holds of horror. Even the skies of spring, even the flowers of summer are poison to me now. My life will not be long. As my uncle went, as Johansen went, so shall I. For I know too much, and the cult still lives.
Cthulhu still lives. Somewhere in that abyss of stone, sealed since the sun was young, he dreams. His city has sunk once more. The vigilant sailed over the spot after the April storm, but his ministers remain. They bellow and prance and slay around idol-capped monoliths in lonely places, keeping the faith alive. He must have been trapped when the city sank again, or else the world would already be screaming in madness. But who can say what the end will be? What has risen may sink. What has sunk may rise. Loathsomeness waits and dreams in the deep. Decay spreads across the tottering cities of men. A time will come, but I dare not think of it. If I do not survive this manuscript, let those who find it put caution before curiosity. Let them seal these words away, for I have seen too much. And I know now, the cult still lives.
And thus the story ended. If you liked this journey into the worlds of classic literature, do not forget to support us by subscribing so we can tell you more. And hey, if there's a classic tale you'd love to hear told in this suspenseful style, drop its name in the comments below. Your suggestion might be our next chilling adventure.